Hi, this is Heidi Burgess, and I'd like to talk about ways of identifying your areas of influence in a conflict. When you're concerned or upset about something, don't just scream and complain, although that sometimes feels good. Do something constructive. But a question I'm also often asked is, what? Well, that's not easy to answer, but there are ways to answer it if you follow certain steps. The first thing that you need to do is stop and think and assess what needs to be done that you can do, how will you do it, with whom, and where. Well, let's unpack some of those questions. This question has several aspects. First of all, you have to figure out what's going on, what the real problems are. I talked a little bit about how to do that in the videos See the Complexity and Conflict Mapping. One of the things that conflict mapping allows you to do is identify the energy centers of the conflict system, or what I call ripe areas for intervention. You can also figure out what to do to influence those ripe areas, and I'll talk about how to do that in a minute. If you remember in the Seeing Complexity video, I talked about how we often in intractable conflicts oversimplify our notion of what's going on to just a story of good guys and bad guys. But it's always more than that. It's more than that in the conflict in Afghanistan. It's more than that in the broader war on terror. And it's more than that in our domestic conflict that I've been talking quite a bit about between Republicans and Democrats, Trump supporters and Hillary supporters, conservatives and liberals. We tend to oversimplify this conflict too into good guys and bad guys, but it's much more than that. This is a conflict map that I showed in the conflict mapping video that was done by General McChrystal in the Department of Defense that shows just some of the complexity going on in Afghanistan. I did a complex but not nearly as pretty conflict map about one aspect of the conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican conflict, looking at the concept of conflict overlays. So here you can see some of the interactions between communication problems, procedural problems, factual problems, framing, oppositional goals, tactics, and issues. And all you can really tell from this is that there's lots of arrows flying all over the place. And it's the pattern of those arrows that indicates what Peter Coleman calls energy centers and what Guy and I call ripe areas for intervention, both of which are indicated by the places that have the most arrows. Now let me show you a simpler diagram here that allows you to see what I mean about the arrows more easily. The red box in the center has arrows coming out from it going to every of the other boxes. But the red box only has one arrow going in, meaning there aren't a whole lot of different things that are influencing it, but it is influencing a lot of different things. That makes the red box a ripe area for intervention. If you can change what's going on there, you can change what's going on in the green box and in the blue box and in the yellow box and in the pink box. On the other hand, there are several different factors that are influencing the yellow box. So if you could influence that arrow that's coming up from the pink box, but you don't do anything about the arrows coming in from blue and red, you may not have very much effect on the yellow box. And the yellow box isn't shown in this diagram to have any influence on anything, so you can change that, but you're not going to change the rest of the system. Now, a good conflict map probably will have hardly any, probably no elements that aren't connected to anything else because everything tends to get intertwined. That's why conflict mapping can easily turn into what we call spaghetti diagrams. However, if you look for the places that have the most arrows going out and the fewest arrows going in, that's a really simple way of seeing potentially ripe areas for intervention. Now, there's other ways to do it too. Another way is to look for what is called tipping points. Now, this term was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book of the same title, The Tipping Point. And what he talks about is situations where if you're not near the tipping point, it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort and a lot of people pushing to try to change the status quo, as if you're trying to push a big rock up a steep hill. But once you get it to the top of the hill and push it over the tipping point, then it's running down the other side and you're either chasing it or getting run over by it, as this picture shows. So that the goal is to get over the tipping point where whatever you're trying to accomplish starts happening much, much faster. Now, a couple examples of this in the real world. One of them is elections. Close elections can be situations where just a few votes can put one candidate or the other over the tipping point. This was a special election that happened in August of this year that came within 2,000 votes of going the other way. Some elections actually revolve around one vote, and this is kind of an amusing article that I cite down at the bottom and talk about in the text accompanying this video of 10 elections that were decided by one vote or less. One of these elections was very recently. The Virginia court tossed out a one-vote victory in Virginia that was thought to have ended the GOP majority in the House. They decided that there actually wasn't a one-vote difference. And if I remember properly, I'm not sure I do, they decided it ended in a tie, and there was actually a draw out of a hat to determine who won. Now, I think that was also challenged, and I don't actually remember how this ended up. But bottom line, it was super close. And anyone who thinks my vote won't count might not be correct. Same-sex marriage is another example that wasn't decided by votes, just votes, although votes played a role. It was also decided through a series of court cases. But the interesting thing that I find about same-sex marriage is the tipping point is very evident. This is a timeline that I found in USA Today that starts in 1972. And there's one event that's listed in 72. There's one event here that's listed in 73. And then it jumps to 93. Nothing happening between 73 and 93. And then the timeline gets much longer, and there get to be an escalating number of things that are happening in the 90s, even more in the 2000s. And then when you get after 2010, the listings get to be much more frequent, some of them being elections favoring gay marriage, some of them being opposition to gay marriage, court cases in favor and against, back and forth, until there's lots of listings in 2015. And between June and January of 2015, you see here 8 different listings culminating in the June 26 United States Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage across the country. The tipping point for this came after long efforts of many people struggling to push that ball up one side of the hill through successive voting and court cases and more voting and more court cases until finally the ball started rolling fast down the other side, culminating in the Supreme Court decision. Now, there's other influence options besides court cases and voting. There's talking to friends and relatives, there's public hearings, there's letters to the editor, and all of these things played a role. People all over the country doing these sorts of things over and over and over again, and making connections and networks. When you're trying to build support for a cause, it's helpful to ask yourself who you know that you can influence and who they know. And what organizations are you in that you can influence, and what organizations are these people in that they could influence? And if you all start working in the same direction, you can do what we call scaling up your influence. So it gets to be collaboratively much, much bigger. This is the basic idea behind our massively parallel peace building. We imagine lots of people working together to scale up their influence on one issue in one way, and using the action list, which lists over 150 different actions that different people in different positions with different skill sets can take to try to move further along a particular uh, social movement goal, such as gay marriage. No one can do that kind of thing by themselves, but everyone can choose one or two things that you can do or you can want to learn to do and get to work. And if you get to work in that way, working with lots of collaborators, you can scale up your influence. And if other people are working on related problems in different ways, you can have really significant impact. And that's what we mean by the notion of massively parallel peace building. And what you need to get started is to figure out where you can get an initial toehold, which you do by figuring out what's going on and what you can do to start the ball rolling, start pushing it up the hill to get over the tipping point. Thanks.